This podcast is an introduction to cellular respiration, so you can write that as your heading. Now, we discussed cellular respiration a little bit in 10th grade biology class, and the basics of what we discussed then is just in general what cellular respiration does, and that is it takes glucose and some oxygen, and it creates ATP, or energy. That's our most important product, plus some water, plus some carbon dioxide. Both of those are considered waste products. So what we're going to do in college biology is we're going to take a little bit closer look at this actual reaction and see how we take that glucose and turn it into energy. How do we make that ATP? And then where do those waste products, the water and the carbon dioxide, actually end up going? So this is how your body gets all the energy it needs to do all of its functions. This ATP is used to move muscles. It's used to do other brain functions. Anything your body needs energy for, this is what happens to it. It gets made from glucose into ATP. The glucose comes from your food, obviously. Plant and animal material can be broken down into glucose, and that is the raw fuel that you use to make this energy, or this ATP. So with that said, let's take a little bit closer look at this particular equation. Okay, so there are actually 3 steps to cellular respiration. Step 1 is called glycolysis, step 2 is called the citric acid cycle, and step 3 is called oxidative phosphorylation. Now, I wouldn't hurry up and write all this down. I'm going to try to go through this step by step pretty slowly. But if it ends up being too fast for you, just pause it. I think it's most important at this point to listen to what I say about each one and kind of follow along with each step. So, we'll start with step 1, glycolysis. Okay, so why do we have to go through this step? First of all, it does produce a little bit of ATP, and remember that was the whole point of this, was to make some ATP. So that's part of our product right there. It also is going to form some hydrogen ion carriers. That's what that H plus is. It means a hydrogen with a positive charge. In other words, it's missing one electron. So it's a hydrogen ion. And you'll see later why it is important that we make these hydrogen ion carriers. They are going to eventually lead to the production of ATP. Okay, so we've got some ATP that's made. We've got hydrogen ion carriers that are made, which will lead to more ATP production. And it also starts the breakdown of glucose. So glucose comes into your cell. It starts this process of glycolysis and starts breaking down so we can get the energy out of it. Okay, step 2 of this process is called the citric acid cycle. It also produces some ATP, and it also produces some hydrogen ion carriers. But you'll see as we go through each of these steps that these 2 processes only produce a little bit of ATP. Sorry, my writing is not great right now. Okay, so they're only producing a little bit of ATP. The majority of our ATP is made here in step 3 in something called oxidative phosphorylation. And that's where these hydrogen ion carriers that we made here and here are now going to be used to make ATP. And this is where we get lots of ATP. So lots ATP. Okay? And remember, the whole goal of this is to take the glucose that we start with and make it into ATP. So by the time we're done with step 3, we've got lots of ATP, lots of energy for the cell to use. So that's the steps of why we do each of these things. Now, the second question hopefully you're wondering yourself is, well, where does this take place into the cell? You know, cellular respiration doesn't mean the cell is breathing. It means the cell is making energy. But there's a specific part of the cell that's responsible for making energy, and hopefully you remember what that is. Okay, the structure in the cell that's responsible for making energy is the mitochondria. So we're going to take a little bit closer look at that. Step 1, the glycolysis step, actually takes place in the cytoplasm. Okay, so that's kind of the filling of the cell. So if we were looking at this diagram down below, all of this kind of yellow area around the mitochondria is the cytoplasm. Okay, so it surrounds the mitochondria. The citric acid cycle is the second step that we discussed in the last slide, and this takes place in the mitochondria in what's called its matrix. And the matrix, see if I can get the right color here, is kind of this interior filling of the cell in blue. Okay, I'm highlighting it a little bit in blue here for you. Okay, so it looks like there's like a little wavy swimming pool in the middle of the mitochondria. That's the matrix, is the interior fluid of the mitochondria, and that's where that citric acid cycle takes place. And then the last part, the oxidative phosphorylation, where we make all sorts of ATP, actually occurs on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So I'm going to do that in red. See if I can trace that out a little bit. So this kind of curvy edge to the swimming pool, so I follow it around with my red pen here, that is the inner membrane of the mitochondria. There we go. Okay, you can see it also has an outer membrane that's labeled for you right here. Okay, that's the brown kind of membrane. So that goes around the edge of the mitochondria. And then there's a space, and then you're into the inner membrane. Now I would recommend you drawing this in your notes, because the inner membrane, the outer membrane, the matrix are all going to be discussed as we go through this process of cellular respiration. So if you can draw that in your notebook with those labels, that will help you as we go along. Okay, one more thing to discuss as an introduction to this and the end of this particular vodcast is some important terms you're going to need to know. And there's a little mnemonic device that is hopefully going to help you remember what these mean. So oil is the first letter of each word in the phrase oxidation is loss. So you see O-I-L. Rig is the first letter in each word of the phrase reduction is gain. So R-I-G. Now what are we talking about here? Oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. What in the heck does that mean? Well, as we move around these hydrogen ions that I talked about earlier and make these different chemicals that go on the way from glucose to ATP, we're going to be moving around electrons, okay? Because electrons are found in bonds between those different things that we're breaking up or adding together. So those electrons are going to determine what happens to the particular chemical that we're adding or subtracting them from. If we say we oxidize something, okay, if I say in my description that this particular molecule is oxidized, that means it has lost what? What are we just talking about in our bonds? Electrons. This is my little symbol for electrons. So if a molecule loses electrons in a chemical process, we say it's oxidized. Okay? If I say a chemical is reduced or has gone through reduction, that means it has gained, again, what? Electrons. Okay, so we're talking about the movement of electrons between different molecules, and the words we use to describe those are oxidation and reduction. If you've taken chemistry already, you've maybe studied redox reactions. The re is from reduction, and the ox is from oxidation. So redox reactions have to do with this moving around of electrons as well. And so I'll be using these terms, as I said. Hopefully you'll be able to refer back to this and remember what that means for what's going on with the electrons.